Today's occurrence is now actually in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and this is part 2 of the Donner Party story. So now it's the beginning of November, and just about everyone at Truckee Lake has accepted the fact that they would have to stick the winter out there. Well, almost everyone. Lewis and Salvatore, the Native Americans sent by Captain Sutter, and some families, including the Reeds, Kesebergs, Eddies, and Breen's family, all decided to try and get over the summit again. They were planning to get through and keep going, and some were tasked with taking the written notes by families, including the Donners, asking Captain Sutter for supplies that they would repay when they made it. They planned to use another pass that was supposed to be less difficult. While they were packing up the animals, everyone was going back and forth on what to be packed. What were the most important items they needed to at least make it over the ridge? Louis Keseberg wrote that as long as it took them to figure out what to take, they could have passed the summit and been on the way to California. His foot was still messed up, so he was stuck on horseback with his foot tied up in a saddle on a sling. By evening, they were close to the top of the ridge, and it was cold and chilly, and everyone was tired from how hard they were working to get up the mountain. Some people decided to sit down and rest, saying they couldn't go any further. So Keseberg, stuck on the horse, begged them to at least get up and get over the ridge for God's sake before stopping. Instead, someone decided to set a pine tree on fire, and the women and children gathered around it to warm themselves up. Then, the oxen started rubbing their packs off against the trees because they weren't fans of walking in the cold and snow. Then Keseberg claims that he could tell unmistakably that the weather was going to turn threatening, so he tried to get everyone moving again. But he said only the strongest man would have been able to get in front and break the road, and only a very determined one could convince everyone to leave the fire. He claims that if he had been well, he would have been able to get everyone over the ridge, and everyone would have followed him. Instead, everyone, including Keseberg, decided to lay in the snow from exhaustion and fell asleep. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is part 2 of the Donner Party story. Keseberg woke up after feeling like he couldn't breathe with heavy weight on his chest. When he came to, he realized he was covered in freshly fallen snow, and so was everyone else in the group, to the point where he couldn't see if anyone was even still on the mountain with him. So he yelled, and it was loud enough to actually wake everyone up. Once they managed to get from under the snow, they realized the mules were lost, the cattle left them, and they wouldn't be able to continue on. They went back to the valley, and some families killed their cattle that they could find and used their hides to fix an already existing cabin. Over the next few days, more people decided to do the same. They built cabins and started stockpiling supplies. Well, Keseberg couldn't build anything with his foot, so he put together a brush shed against the side of the Breen's family cabin. More people also decided to kill their cattle for food, and Eddie started hunting to help, but he eventually had to kill his only ox too. At the same time, back on the trail, the two Donner families, with George and Jacob Donner, made it but had to stop. The snow hit them faster than they were expecting it to. They had no time to build a cabin. Each brother barely had time to set up the tent for their families, so they threw together what they could. George Donner found some brush that was open on one side, covered it with pine, rubber coats, and quilts. It sounds like Jacob Donner actually managed to get his tent up for his family. But after a few days, the snow got to be about 4 feet deep, so they needed to improve their shelter. They did what they could, but ultimately it was an uphill battle because some members of the Donner family didn't want to even help shovel the snow. The Donners were effectively camped at Alder Creek. On the other side of the mountain, James Reed tried to return back from Sutter's Fort with the new supplies and Native American guides. McCutcheon, left behind from the original supply run, joined him too, since he was feeling better. Reed saw clouds forming over the mountains a few days before they left, and he hoped and prayed that winter wouldn't come early. When they started making their way back, they traveled through heavy rain. When they made it to Bear Valley, they found 18 inches of snow. There was a husband and wife, the Curtises, in a tent there, and they were so happy to see Reed's group because they were so desperate for food that they killed their dog. In fact, when Reed arrived, they had the last piece of their dog baking in the oven. Reed told them they could help themselves to the beef and flour he had. The Curtises offered them some of their dog, and Reed and McCutcheon tried it. They said it was a very good dog. The wife made dinner for everyone using some of the food Reed brought. Before leaving, Reed left them with a few days' supplies of food and promised to come back for the couple so they can join his family on their way to their destination in California. That night, Reed's group went higher up in the mountains to camp for the night. Well, overnight, they woke up to the sound of horses riding away, so Reed and McCutcheon go to check it out. The Native Americans were nowhere to be found, so McCutcheon got on his horse and went back to the Curtis's camp. Turns out, the natives stopped there to warm themselves up before continuing on out of the valley. I'm guessing the now 2.5 feet of snow had something to do with it. They weren't interested in doing what Reed had planned, so they left. Reed and McCutcheon decided to continue their efforts to the party, and the further they went, the deeper the snow got. Once it reached 4 feet deep, the horses started giving up from exhaustion, so Reed and McCutcheon decided to just continue with the best horses, even though they started with 17. And eventually, even the best ones couldn't keep going because the snow was up to the horses' heads. You could only see them holding their noses above the snow and part of their heads. Obviously, the horses couldn't keep going like that, so they left those horses too, believing they could get further on foot. Reed and McCutcheon quickly realized that wasn't any better and decided to turn back. Both of them had always lived in areas where they didn't need to know much about snow or snowshoes, so that was a teaching moment for them. They went back to the couple's camp in Bear Valley and told them to get ready to leave the next day. They packed the couple's belongings on one horse and managed to find a spot in the valley where there was barely any snow and still vegetation for the animals to eat, which was lucky because the animals hadn't eaten in several days. Back at the lake, with most of the party, the cabin building escalated. At least 3 double cabins were built. They were the Breen's cabin, the Murphy cabin, and the Reed Graves cabin. The Reed Graves cabin was split in half, and Stanton and the Native Americans that came with him and didn't get the chance to make it back to Sutter's Fort stayed with the Reeds. Eddie started having a harder time hunting, and by November 9th, most of the cattle had been killed. Yes, all of that was just in the first week of November. They decided to kill the cattle that they had left because the snow covered the ground, so there wasn't anything for the animals to eat. They ran out of salt to store the meat, but it was okay because they were able to freeze the meat outside in the snow. Around this time, with Reed, McCutcheon, and the Curtises, they were heading back to Sutter's Fort, and McCutcheon snapped a little. Reed and McCutcheon were left to handle Curtis's horse, while Curtis tried to handle the rest of his animals. The horse gave them a hard time, so McCutcheon asked Curtis to come back and get the horse under control. Curtis ignored him, and at some point, McCutcheon became so fed up he started beating Curtis until Curtis said he would take care of the horse if McCutcheon didn't kill him. On November 11th, Reed and McCutcheon made it to Sutter's Fort and told Captain Sutter what happened and how many cattle the party had when they left them. Captain Sutter said if they killed the cattle and stored it in the snow, they should be okay until help was able to get to them. There wasn't anyone in the area able to help them now, since all of the able-bodied men went to fight the Mexicans. But he told Reed he could go to what is modern-day San Francisco and ask the naval officer in command for help. Now, obviously, Reed's concerned for his family's well-being, and he knew a legit organized effort would be required to get them. What he didn't know was everything that happened after he left. He left before everyone else's animals started dying too, by the dozens, from starvation and raids from some of the Native American tribes. He knew his family lost a lot, but not that everyone's families lost a lot. Back at Truckee Lake on the 12th, a group of the stronger men and women decided to try and cross the mountain again. The weather had been clear for a day or two, and some of them were going to see if the road was cleared enough for the cattle and wagons to cross. The men with families and young children wanted to get them out of there. Others were trying to get to Sutter's Fort for supplies and to take the notes of other families too. Unfortunately, they didn't get far at all before they had to turn back. On the 13th, 14th, and 15th, Eddie had a stroke of luck hunting. He killed 3 ducks, an 800-pound bear, and a squirrel. Now, no one would give Eddie a gun to use to hunt unless he promised to give them half of what he killed, which just shows how people were starting to think about food now. On the 21st, 16 men and 6 women, including Stanton and Lewis and Salvatore, decided to try crossing the mountain again. They've been stuck at Truckee Lake for over 2 weeks now, and the weather has been clear and nice. The snow in the valley was almost gone, so they were confident on their chance to make it across. They didn't bring any animals this time, they just went on foot. When they got to the pass, Eddie measured the snow, and it was 25 feet, or almost 8 meters deep. Some accounts say they used snowshoes to cross, others say they didn't make those until later. Either way, they made it through the pass and to the west side of that part of the mountain. They stopped in a valley where the snow was 6 feet deep and tried to build a fire, but struggled because of how weak everyone was. At this point, only the Native Americans really knew the way out, but they refused to leave without Captain Sutter's mules. The problem was, Stanton didn't want to return the mules because he knew Sutter would expect payment, and he didn't want to be the one to pay for it. So the group turned around and went back to the lake because the two natives weren't showing the way without the mules. They made it back on the 23rd, and some people planned to try again a few days later. They were hoping the snow froze over the last few days. The day before they planned to leave, it looked like a snowstorm was coming in. They hoped it would hold off long enough for them to leave the next morning, but it hit them the same day. At first, it was light snow and rain or sleet, but by the 28th, the snow picked up and left them with about 10 inches of soft, wet snow. The weather wasn't that cold, but they weren't able to try and cross the mountain in it. The Donner families over at Alder Creek sent a teamster with a note to Truckee Lake, asking them to purchase a list of items and anything else he thought they might need, with George Donner saying he would pay when he made it to California. By November 13th, there were about 5 feet of snow. The Breens killed their last ox after trading 2 of them for someone else's wood. James Reed, on the west side of the mountains, decided to temporarily abandon his rescue efforts. He joined the fight in the Mexican-American War. Of course, when this happened, a good chunk of the states that I've listed, California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Wyoming, and plenty of others, were not part of America yet. They were part of Mexico. We took half of it and then paid them off for half back. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's not what this is about, so I digress. Reed joining the war at first glance is skeptical, but the letter he was given allowed him to be sent to Colonel Fremont without issues to volunteer for service. The letter was sent from Fort Sacramento, so it's possible he went to Fort Sacramento for help, and they either told him he needed to help with the war before they would help him, or he decided on his own that joining the fight and greasing the right elbows would make them more inclined to help him get his family. It's also possible that he realized he couldn't help his family and he had nothing better to do, so he chose to join the fight to be useful somewhere. Now, for the first half of December, not much happens with the Donner Party. It continued to snow, more animals were killed or they wandered off and assumed dead in the snow, including the mules Stanton was supposed to return. There were a couple of clear days, but it immediately went back to being cold and snowing. And on the clear days, most people didn't want to move because they were too weak and it was too hard to cut wood to start fires for warmth and cooking food. On the 9th, someone fell into a critical state due to starvation and required constant assistance. On the same day, Stanton asked families around the lake for food for him, Lewis, and Salvatore. No one wanted to give them anything. So he wrote a letter to the Donners asking if they would send him their best tobacco. He told them the storm kept them from getting over the mountain before, but now they were making snowshoes to go on foot. And he wondered if he could also get their compass since the snow was so deep and it would help them if another storm hit. Stanton assured them that their teamster and William Graves were coming back, so they could bring the compass back to them. He also told them that all the mules wandered off, so if any came to their camp, let someone camped at Truckee Lake know immediately. On December 15th, Bayless Williams, who worked for the Reeds, I guess was kind of sickly before they even left Springfield, died, before starvation even actually set in for him. Then, on December 16th, 15 members of the Donner Party decided to make another attempt at crossing the mountain. William Graves made 17 pairs of snowshoes out of wagon bows and oxhide. Since he was from Vermont, he was the only person in the party that knew how to make them. Not everyone going on the trip got a pair, because he just wasn't able to make enough, but they knew that most people would need them, because just at the valley, there were 8 feet or 2.5 meters of snow. They weren't just trying to cross the mountains, they were trying to make it to where they could get help at the first settlement, Johnson's Ranch. Everyone was in a state of desperation. Their eyes were sunken in, their cheeks were hollow, Mrs. Murphy was going blind, they were out of options, they had to go. Each person took about 8 pounds of beef to last what they hoped would be a 10-day trip. Most of the children and the weaker members were left behind. although apparently a bit after they started, maybe 1 or 2 people turned back. Accounts kind of differ on that, but the part of the Donner Party now headed to Johnson's Ranch is called the Snowshoe Party. The Snowshoe Party made decent progress over the next few days. On the first day, they made it 4 miles, and it varied anywhere from 3 to 6 miles per day as they continued on. They made it past the summit by the second night, and the snow was on and off. Stan kept falling behind because he was suffering from snow blindness, which is almost like having a sunburn on your eyeballs. It's a bit more technical than that, but it's caused by UV rays reflecting off the ice and snow in areas where the air is thinner, so there's not as much protection from UV rays, like on a high, snow-covered mountain. It also causes blurry vision, so Stanton would just do his best to catch up to them every night whenever they found a place to camp. He usually rolled in about an hour behind everyone else. That is, until December 20th, because the Snowshoe Party traveled further that day. That morning, Stanton decided to hang back for a bit to smoke, while everyone else started on the day's journey. They made it 8 miles before setting up camp for the night, and Stanton was nowhere to be found. By the 21st, he still hadn't been seen. The Snowshoe Party at this point was in 6 Mile Valley and had traveled approximately 30 of the 150 miles they needed to make it to the closest settlement. From the west end of the 6 Mile Valley, the trail descends west to a small valley below Immigrant Gap. Immigrant Gap separates the American River drainage from the Bear River drainage. Going towards Immigrant Gap would have brought the Snowshoe Party to the very obvious 700-foot descent into Bear Valley. Unfortunately, the Snowshoe Party turned south towards the North Fork of the American River and ended up in present-day Onion Valley. This was also the day they finished eating all of the meat they packed that was supposed to last the entire journey. Now, back at Truckee Lake, Teamster Milt Elliott returned from the Donner's family camp. He reported that Jacob Donner, Joseph Reinhardt, Sam Shoemaker, and James Smith had died, and everyone else still alive there wasn't in the best shape. On the 23rd, Teamster Elliott took some of his meat to the Donner family camp. It started snowing the day before, so he couldn't return earlier than that. The same snow also grounded the Snowshoe Party, although some accounts claim they were waiting to see if Stanton might show up. When the Snowshoe Party started moving again, they realized they were lost. Where they were didn't look like the extreme description of Bear Valley that Stanton told them about. Since Lewis and Salvatore were guiding them, most of the party lost confidence in them, which confused the natives, and this is where everyone really started reaching that state of desperation. That night it would rain, making it impossible for them to start a fire, and it continued into the next morning, Christmas Eve. Most of the men in the Snowshoe Party wanted to follow their tracks back to Truckee Lake. Lewis and Salvatore didn't want to, and the women and Eddie wanted to follow them. In fact, the women and Eddie said that they would continue on or stay there and die. The rest of the men argued that they hadn't had food for the last 2 days, on top of the fact that since they started the journey, they only had 1 ounce of meat per meal. They were at a stalemate until Patrick Dolan suggested they should randomly select who should be killed for food. Eddie agreed with that, but William Foster, the guy who accidentally shot William Pike in part 1, did not. So then Eddie suggested that 2 people should each get a gun and fight until one or both were killed. That was objected to. So then Eddie said they should continue on their journey, following the natives until someone died. And that was what everyone agreed to. They only managed to make it down the mountain 3 miles after that, because the rain turned into snow. Now, the Snowshoe Party had a small hatchet with them that they used to cut wood for fires. It would be incredibly difficult to do because of how small the hatchet was, on top of all the wood being wet, but they managed to do it. They got a large fire going and camped until Christmas. By Christmas night, the snow turned into a full-on snowstorm. They knew they would need some wood, and some members of the Snowshoe Party went to go get it. But this time, while they were gathering wood, the hatchet flew from the handle and was lost in the snow. A little after that, Antonio, a shepherd from New Mexico, died from exhaustion, hypothermia, and starvation. And then a huge gust of wind came in and blew out every last spark of the fire. Now, Eddie's life as a trapper in the Rocky Mountains taught him how to survive a snowstorm without fire, if there's a small group of people. He tried to get everyone to follow his instructions so they wouldn't get buried in the snow and die, but most of the people at that point were delirious and asking God for mercy and relief. It took about 2 hours for him to get them together and covered up. Eddie spread out a blanket on the snow and had everyone sit down on the blanket in a circle as close as possible. Everyone piles their feet together in the center. Then Eddie spreads a blanket on top of everyone's heads and puts a piece of wood or snow on the ends to hold it down. Then he got in the center of the circle, and everyone's body heat and breathing would keep them warm inside. Before Eddie finished setting up and getting himself inside, he went over to Graves, who refused to get up, and Eddie told him he was dying. Like, you're laying in the snow and okay with the situation because you're literally dying right now. And Graves just replied, "I do not care." And he died a little bit after that. Apparently, though, before he died, he told his daughter, who came with him, that she had to keep fighting and do whatever it takes to get the help for the rest of their family. The snowshoe party would stay in the blanket huddle for the next 36 hours. Back at Truckee Lake, some of those left behind made the most of the holiday. They had about 2 feet of snow, and for Christmas, Virginia Reed and her siblings enjoyed a few dried apples, beans, a small piece of bacon, and tripe, which is the lining of the stomach of farm animals. Mrs. Reed saved it up weeks earlier because she wanted them to at least have a treat for Christmas. In the Murphy household, Mrs. Murphy made a meal of boiled bones and oxtail soup. After she put the babies to bed, she became seriously ill later that night. At 10 a.m. on the 26th, with the snowshoe party still huddled in the blankets, Patrick Dolan turned deranged and ran away from the group. Eddie had to chase him down and drag him back to the huddle, where everyone held him there by force until 4 p.m. when he died. Later that night, one of Murphy's teenage sons became deranged and started talking about food. He would end up dying too. The next day, the storm died down in the afternoon, and Eddie was able to quickly start a fire inside of a dry pine tree. And at this point, having gone 4 days without food, on top of barely eating anything for the past 2 months, the snowshoe party realized the only way they would survive is to eat the remains of their dead family and friends. They stripped the flesh from their bones and dried it over the next few days. In the beginning, the 2 natives and Eddie were refusing to succumb to cannibalism, but eventually, Eddie caved. For the natives, cannibalism is viewed differently than it was to immigrants. In native culture, cannibalism is a very complex topic, depending on the tribe and the circumstance. In some cultures, it's related to religious ceremonies or rituals, like eating a small portion of an enemy warrior as a form of psychological warfare or torture, or to humiliate enemies, or some of a deceased relative to absorb their strength or spirit. There are some instances where native tribes had to succumb to cannibalism to survive, and there are many instances where natives see cannibalism as being completely subhuman and punishable by death. So for Louis and Salvatore, they probably held out longer because there was just more to it for them, among other things. Everyone was able to avoid eating a relative, so that was a bonus. The group managed to travel 4 miles the next day and 6 the following day. They ended December camping on the Sawtooth Ridge overlooking the Sacramento Valley. Although people are torn if that's the actual location they were at, but back at Truckee Lake, Mrs. Reed was low-key robbed when one of the Donner's teamsters named John Denton found her gold. After finding it and pointing it out to her, Mrs. Reed said that she wished it was bread instead. He found more gold and put it in his pocket before telling her, "If we ever get away from here, I'm coming back for more." Charles Berger, who was a teamster for the Kesebergs, made it back to Truckee Lake. He originally left with the snowshoe party, but ended up turning back. He fell ill and died a few days after returning. And Breen, who, by the way, kind of lost the plot a little bit over the past few weeks and turned hyper-religious in his journals, realized Keseberg had Wolfinger's rifle, the German who mysteriously disappeared before. Some of the party suspected foul play, and more than a few believed Keseberg was involved. And after Charles Berger died, Keseberg took his nice belongings, so that didn't help him try to beat the allegations at all. On New Year's Day, 1847, the snowshoe party experienced the most fatiguing day's journey they had so far. The group had to climb out of a 2,000-foot deep canyon with swollen and bloody feet. Jay Fosdick was struggling more than the rest, so Eddie told him he wouldn't make it much longer if he didn't gather some more strength. By January 2nd, the snowshoe party realized they could walk without using the snowshoes. It didn't give them that much relief though, because their feet were so frozen and swollen that they were bleeding with every step. It was so bad that one of the natives lost a toe at the first joint, and they finished eating all of the remains of the dead, so they were out of food again. This is also the day we find out why James Reed joined the war and when he was finished fighting. The next day, the snowshoe party stayed in camp because of how weak Fosdick was. They traveled 7 miles total on the second and third days of the year. Now, the first few days back at Truckee Lake turned grim. They started running out of food. Apparently, the Breens buried some meat for teamster Milt Elliott, but since he hadn't taken it yet, it sounds like they ate it. Mrs. Reed also considered taking her kids and trying to cross the Sierra Nevada because her food was running low too. And actually, the following morning, Mrs. Reed, her daughter Virginia Reed, teamster Milt Elliott, and the Reed family servant named Eliza Williams decided to try crossing the mountain. That morning felt like a fine spring morning, so Mrs. Reed left the rest of her children with the Breens, the Kesebergs, and the Graves. They dried up what little meat they had and set out on foot on the mountain. Virginia Reed said it was hard to leave her siblings with strangers because they didn't know if they would ever see them again, and they had to bribe the kids with bread to get them to stay inside so they could leave. On the night of the 4th, the snowshoe party woke up and realized Louis and Salvatore left them. Some accounts say that Louis and Salvatore actually left and ate the remains on the 31st, but apparently on the 31st or the 4th, someone in the snowshoe party suggested they should kill the 2 natives for food. It sounds like Eddie was the only one who was against that idea. He wasn't okay with murder, and the only reason any of them were even alive and made it this far was because of Louis and Salvatore. So he quietly informed Louis of what everyone else was planning and told them to leave quickly. The expression on Louis's face was something Eddie could never forget because Louis didn't say a single word in response. He just stood up, completely taken aback, and after a couple of minutes, his face settled into a sullen expression before he left. On the 5th, the snowshoe party followed the bloody footprints of Louis and Salvatore. About a mile into it, they saw fresh deer footprints in the snow. Eddie and Mary Graves followed the deer's footprints and managed to kill it, but because they had to follow the footprints 8 miles to the bottom of a mountain, that night, Eddie and Mary Graves camped with the deer while everyone else stayed on top of the mountain with Jay Fosdick because he couldn't continue on. By the time Mary Graves and Eddie made it back to everyone else with the deer the next day, quote, "the flesh was taken from the bones of poor Fosdick," end quote. Apparently he died the night before, and everyone but his wife tasted him. One account told what happened in a much more graphic way, but I'm just going to leave that out. Over the next day or two, the snowshoe party went down one mountain and over another, making it about 2.5 miles in total. Their feet were so bruised and swollen that they literally burst open. The fragments of the blankets they wrapped their feet in were completely soaked in blood. On the 8th, Mrs. Reed's group made it back to Truckee Lake. The day after they left, Eliza turned back, while the rest of them tried to continue on after making snowshoes. After just a handful of days, they realized they weren't going to make it. There was just too much snow, they couldn't find the road, and when they got to the top of the mountain, when they looked out, all they could see was snow and the tops of trees sticking out of it. It sounds like they just became discouraged and thought that they had better odds turning around. Once they made it back, obviously the food was scarce, and the Reeds ended up having to kill and eat their dog. After that, they had nothing to eat but the raw hides on the roof of their cabin that they used to keep out snow. Pretty soon, the Reeds had to move in with the Breens, because after eating their roof, they couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. Eliza and Milt Elliott were sent to the Donner family, and also on the 8th, with the snowshoe party, Eddie and Foster got into it, because Foster wanted to kill Mrs. McCutcheon because she couldn't keep up with everyone else, and I guess it just annoyed him. Eddie obviously rejected that idea, so then Foster suggested that they kill Mary Graves and Mrs. Fosdick. So Eddie told him, "I'm going to tell them what you just said," and he announced what Foster said in front of everyone. Foster said he didn't care, he could handle Eddie, and then grabbed a large club while Eddie grabbed a knife. The women in the party managed to stop Eddie from killing Foster, and then Eddie told him, "If you ever show even the slightest indication you're going to kill anyone in this party, I will kill you." The whole thing is kind of insane to think about, because Foster accidentally killed Pike before, and was the only person completely against cannibalism from the jump. He was originally the only person who wanted no part in eating people at all. And it's also kind of shocking because they just ate Jay Fosdick and an entire deer. Like, when Mary Graves and Eddie returned to the group after seeing what they did, they all still ate the deer. No one should have been starving to that extent at that point. They literally just ate, and it's not clear if they finished eating all of the deer or if they still had some left. Nonetheless, the next day, the snowshoe party stumbled onto Louis and Salvatore. One account says that Salvatore is already dead, and Louis was laying down drinking from a small stream. It goes on to say that they tried to help him and offer him food, but he wasn't able to eat and only lived for an hour. The other account says that they made it about 2 miles from their last camp when they stumbled upon Louis and Salvatore. They were both lying on the ground, looking totally helpless, but alive. They had been without food for 8 or 9 days, and had been at least 4 without fire. The natives both looked like they wouldn't last more than 3 hours, so Foster volunteered to put them out of their misery. Eddie couldn't bear to watch, so he walked away, and after Louis and Salvatore were shot, both of their remains were stripped for food. The next couple of days, the snowshoe party traveled about 17 miles following an Indian trail. They went through the hills between the North Fork of the American River and the Bear River. They were looking for the easiest way west to Johnson's Ranch, which they were about 16 miles away from. Since the distance they traveled would have actually been 10 miles, it sounds more like there was a lot of wandering around and getting lost. On the evening of the 12th, the snowshoe party arrived at a Native American village, and their appearance was so haggard and miserable that it overwhelmed the natives. They managed to snap out of it and were kind enough to help them and give them acorns. The next day, that village put them on the trail where the snowshoe party would travel 4 miles through a heavy rainstorm to another village, and it just kind of continued on like that for a few days. On January 16th, the California Star published an article titled "Emigrants in the Mountains," and it said, quote, "It is probably not generally known to the people that there is now the California mountains the most distressing situation of a party of immigrants from the United States, who are prevented from crossing the mountain by an early fall of snow." The party consisted of about 60 persons, men, women, and children. They were almost entirely out of provisions when they reached the foot of the mountains, and but for the timely support forwarded to them by Captain J.A. Sutter, one of the most humane and liberal men in California, they must have all perished. Captain Sutter, as soon as he ascertained their situation, sent 5 mules loaded with provisions to them. A second party was dispatched with provisions, but they found the mountain impossible in consequence of the snow. "We hope that our citizens will do something for the relief of these unfortunate people." End quote. On the 17th, the snowshoe party had a Native American guide to lead them to Johnson's settlement. But after about 2 or 3 miles, Foster and the women couldn't keep walking. Their feet were so swollen that they literally couldn't go any further. Eddie was able to continue on, though, so the guide continued taking him to the settlement, and he made it there just before sunset. It was an 18-mile walk. When Eddie made it to the first house, the woman who answered the door immediately burst into tears. She got him into bed, gave him some food, and informed the other neighbors on what had happened. The neighbors immediately started gathering necessary items to take to the rest of the snowshoe party. The Native American guides led them back to the rest of the snowshoe party, and they made it to them around midnight. Apparently, one guy was tasked with cooking food the whole night, and Eddie told him not to give the snowshoe party as much food as they were asking for. However, because they kept crying and begging for food, the guy kept cooking it, and the snowshoe party kept eating the whole night until there was nothing left. On the 18th, some of the neighbors from Johnson's Ranch got on horseback to get the snowshoe party and bring them back to the settlement. Everyone was shocked at how far Eddie walked and said if they hadn't rode on horseback themselves, they never would have believed it. Apparently, the last 6 miles of the journey, they could see Eddie's bloody footprints. So now the snowshoe party that started out with 16 members was down to 5 women and 2 men. They would later be named the Forlorn Party. But they informed the people at the settlement that they still had family and friends on the other side of the Sierra Nevada mountains, completely buried in snow and probably out of everything they needed. Unfortunately, at Johnson's Ranch, there were only 3 or 4 families of poor immigrants besides Johnson's. About 14 men in total, and they couldn't really do anything without help from other settlements. Sutter's Fort was the closest place that they could go to for help, but it had been raining there the entire winter, so that whole area was covered with water. Bear River was overflowing into the Sacramento Plains from there to Sutter's Fort. A guy named John Rhodes, who journeyed through the area during the rainy season, said that if there was no other way, he would go on foot, but didn't have a way to cross the river. so they decided to build a boat. John Rhodes would cross the river on the raft on January 20th and informed Captain Sutter and the settlers nearby of what happened. Captain Sutter and one of the wealthiest men in the country, who happened to be like 2 miles away from Sutter's fort, would team up to provide supplies to those stuck at Truckee Lake. 5 or 6 men from the settlement would volunteer to go take the supplies. That same day, James Reed, who was done fighting in the war, claimed land for his family in California. Now back at Truckee Lake, over the past week or so, the snow made it to be about 13 feet deep before leveling off. Mrs. Murphy went completely blind and eventually had to start relying on others to get wood for her family or take them in when that wasn't possible. People had to share one axe between them to cut wood. The Keseberg's baby that was born on the trail fell sick, along with Breen's wife and one of his teenage sons. The meat was running dangerously low, minus the Reeds since they ran out a while ago and were still eating cowhide. Eliza, their servant, was fed up with eating the glue and would go to be with other families asking for food, but they turned her away. Whenever they cooked the cowhides, it would turn into like a glue-like substance in the pots. So they were literally eating glue. On the 21st, Milt Elliott returned from the Donners and reported that they were doing okay. Another snowstorm hit over the next few days, and the hides that everyone had started eating, since only a few people still had meat, were running low. On the 24th, Louis Keseberg Jr., the baby, died, and 3 of the Murphys' teenage boys under the age of 16 are sick. The Murphys are not able to keep a fire going enough to cook the animal hides. Mrs. Murphy went to the Breens for help, and they did what they could. On the 30th, the Graves family robbed the Reeds and took the hides that they were eating and that were also covering their cabin. Well, technically, the Reeds owed the Graves a debt that they wanted repaid. Because James Reed killed their teamster, and then they took care of his family when he left after that. Reed was supposed to pay that because he was wealthy enough to do so when they all made it to California. However, the Graves decided they wanted repayment now. On January 31st, 15-year-old Landrum Murphy died. On the 1st of February, Reed went to San Francisco with a petition from some of the prominent citizens of San Jose. He asked the commander of the Navy to help him go back to his family. The commander basically made an estimate of how much it would cost to do that. The commander was completely sympathetic to Reed, but he just didn't think Washington would greenlight using resources for that. So Reed asked some of the citizens for their advice, and they told him not to bother the commander about it anymore. Instead, they would call a meeting with all of the citizens and see what they could do to help. At the meeting, at least $1,300 was raised for Reed to get supplies to go help his family. That's almost $50,000 today. But Reed was ultimately given the green light to, quote, raise as many men with horses as would be required, end quote. The Navy decided to back him, and a man named Caleb Greenwood was contracted to supply 20 horses or mules and 8 men, including McCutcheon, for $800. And the irony is, he was the person that discovered the cutoff I mentioned in part 1, the one that bypassed Bridger's Fort and caused them to promote Hastings' cutoff to Reed and the other immigrants. It was named Greenwood's Cutoff. Now, Greenwood is just the man for the job, I guess, because 2 or 3 years before this, he led the first party to successfully bring wagons over the Sierra Nevada, and then discovered the cutoff the year after while guiding 50 wagons. Now, the group with Reed and Greenwood would be called the Second Relief. Reed wasn't in charge, but he did have some say. They would leave San Francisco to head for Sonoma Creek for more supplies and men to help with the rescue effort. On the 5th, a group called the First Relief left Johnson's Ranch. It was a group of 13 men, including William Eddy, going back to the mountains to bring supplies. The 12 other men started as 2 different groups that heard about what happened and came to help. They each had 50 pounds of supplies, a heavy blanket, and tools. Now, Eddy was desperate to get back to his family because he left behind his wife and 2 children. Unfortunately, the same day they left Johnson's Ranch was the day his 5-year-old daughter, Margaret, died. Also happening at Truckee Lake on that day was the Breens being down to just a little bit of meat left and only part of 3 hides that they had used to help support the Reeds. Because the Reeds only had 1 hide left, but the Graves had it. Milt Elliott was living with the Graves, and it was speculated that he would keep it for himself. Over the next 2 days, Mrs. Reed got some hide from Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Eddy died, and it was revealed that 1-year-old Harriet McCutcheon died several days earlier. Augustus Spitzer also died. He was one of the men that stayed back with Wolfinger when he disappeared in part 1. Apparently, he asked for a piece of meat to be placed on his mouth as he died so he could go easy and at peace. It doesn't sound like he was given his last request, though. And then Milt Elliott was now at the Murphys and not able to get out of bed. On the 9th, it sounds like William Pike's children aren't doing well, and Keseberg at this point claims he's unable to get up at all. Mrs. Eddy and Margaret were finally able to be buried, and Milt Elliott died, which Virginia Reed and maybe other members of her family seemed to take hard. She said Elliott was faithful like a brother and their best friend. Her mother helped her cover Elliott in snow. Now, of course, other accounts say that after he went to stay with the Murphys, they shared ox hides with him, but of course, since what they're actually eating is glue, he starved to death, and that 2 other men buried him. A John Denton wasn't looking too good either, and was traveling with the Donners as a teamster, but also as their friend. The first half of February for their first relief wasn't smooth sailing, but it was worlds better than the journey the forlorn party had getting there. They had been dealing with nonstop rainfall, several inches deep, but making good progress. At first, they were moving 10 to 15 miles a day and had to swim animals across streams. When they went across a steep hollow crossing, they almost lost a few horses to the current and had to cut them out from under roots they got stuck in. Once the first relief party hit snow, progress slowed. They hit Mule Springs, which is north of Bear River, and they started moving about 4 to 6 miles a day. Once the snow reached maybe 3 feet, maybe 8 feet, accounts differ, but whichever it was too deep to keep going on horseback. So they decided to unpack the animals, and William Eddy and someone else were told to take the animals back to Johnson's ranch. The rest of the first relief men built a brush tent to keep extra supplies in, and 2 men were left there to guard it. The other 10 men carried 50 pounds worth of supplies each, minus one guy who only did 25, to Bear River. They tried to make snowshoes because the snow got to be about 15 feet deep, but because it was so soft, it didn't help much, so they ended up not using them. When they made it to Bear Valley, they looked for the Curtis wagon. Apparently, when Reed was taking the Curtises back to Sutter's Fort, they buried a wagon after he realized he wasn't making it back to his family. Well, it was under 10 feet of snow, and all of the flour stored was destroyed by the bear. It doesn't specify if it meant bear the animal or bear the river, but considering what happens later on, I'm going to assume they mean the animal bear. Now, the first half of February for the second relief was mostly uneventful. They made it to Sonoma and got everything they needed, including 10 government horses, 4 saddles, and brittles. Then Reed left with 5 men, heading for Napa, and picked up more men on the way. But on the 13th, I guess news broke out about how the forlorn party managed to survive long enough to make it to Johnson's ranch. Several papers published accounts of what happened. The Monterey, California spoke about how 60 immigrants were left on the other side of the California mountain. 19 left, but only 7 made it, and the survivors were kept alive by, quote, eating the dead bodies. The California Star talked about Greenwood leading the rescue back, and how Captain Sutter received a letter about everything that had happened. Apparently, the writer of the letter had the opinion that the whole party would have reached California Valley before the first fall of snow if the men had exerted themselves as they were supposed to. It basically sounded like, for one, everyone was distressed to hear that people were having to eat other people to make it to help. 2, that 5 women and 2 men were the survivors, and that the women were so young. And 3, that they hoped this would be a learning lesson for everyone ever planning a trip to the West, and that everyone needs to cross the mountain by the 1st of October from now on. They also had no problem blasting Hastings Cutoff and said, quote, it's a route which we hope no one will ever attempt again, end quote. Back with the Donner Party on the 15th, Mrs. Graves refused to give Mrs. Reed any hides. She actually chose to put her hides on her cabin to keep Mrs. Reed's from getting to them. Patrick Breen described Mrs. Graves as a case because she was behaving irrationally, and over the next 4 days, nothing super eventful happens with anyone at Truckee Lake, but it is noted that everyone started to feel increasingly weak. Now, with the first relief on the 15th, 3 men quit, so they were down to 7 men, and Captain Tucker told the remaining men that if they kept with him until the end, they would each get $5 a day from the day they started dealing with the snow. That's almost $190 today. The route they took had them traveling by the Yuba River. Otherwise, the 25 feet of snow they were battling probably would have made more men quit, regardless of the payday. To help lighten the load, and for the return trip, since the first relief didn't really have a guide, all they knew was what they were told from the forlorn party, which was the rest of the Donner Party was at Truckee Lake. But as they continued, they would set fire to every dead pine tree on or near the trail at the end of every 3 days' journey, which averaged burning a tree every 15 to 20 miles. To lighten the amount of meat they were carrying, they would make a small bundle and hang it up on a tree to lighten the load on the way to the Donner Party, but also so they would have food coming back. The first relief reached the other side of the dreaded pass that trapped everyone at Truckee Lake previously on February 18th, and crossed the frozen Truckee Lake that evening. When they got there, they looked around but didn't see a single living thing and initially thought everyone was already dead. So they decided to holler a little bit and then saw a woman coming out of a hole in the snow. She asked them if they came from California or from heaven. When they went up to her, several others of the Donner Party came out of the snow. The sight was shocking, to say the least, for the First Relief men, so much as to say, one of the men in the group said he would never forget the horrible and ghastly sight they presented. The First Relief gave the Donner Party food very sparingly and set someone up to guard the rest of the food they brought overnight so that all of the starving people wouldn't gorge themselves on it and overeat and die. Some of the First Relief went to check on the Donners and let everyone know that they would leave in 3 to 4 days, taking anyone who was able to travel, and that they planned to get everyone out with more help on the way. When 3 of the First Relief members made it to the Donners camp, they discovered most of the men had died, one of them leaving a wife and 8 children. The 2 families only had 1 beef head between them. Apparently there were 2 cows buried in the snow, but I guess the snow was too deep for them to be able to try and find it. But the men told them that they would have assistance, if possible, on the road back and passed around some meat. The next day, they brought back George Donner's 2 oldest daughters from his previous marriage, 2 of Jacob Donner's sons, Mrs. Wolfinger, and Noah James. Both of the Donner wives decided to stay back with their younger children. They would have been able to make it themselves, but they were not strong enough to carry multiple kids, and the kids themselves weren't big enough to walk. The First Relief Party had already agreed to take as many of the little ones that they could from those staying at Truckee Lake. And sometime after the First Relief arrived, one of William Pike's children died. On February 22nd, 23 of the Donner Party survivors started the journey to California with the First Relief. All of the Reeds were actually well enough to leave too, but 2 of the younger children weren't able to push through the snow, so they were taken back to Truckee Lake and left with Breen. Mrs. Reed had a hard time doing that, but was ultimately convinced to leave them because she was told by the First Relief men, hey, if you go back to stay with your children, we've only left so much food. If you go back, you're going to eat through what we left for them faster. And I guess that ultimately convinced her to leave them behind. The same day, the Second Relief set out with around 22 men, including 1 Native American. This entire time, they had some delays and were busy preparing food and packing 700 pounds of flour and 200 pounds of meat. That day, they traveled about 10 miles. The next day, the First Relief, now with 20-ish Donner Party members, made it to the first place they planned to pick up the food they left along the route. It was in the dreaded pass, and unfortunately, when they made it, they found half of the food was taken by the bear. Being as this time it really only makes sense that it was an animal bear is why I was confused before, because why are we saying the bear? But I digress. So immediately, I guess, being on short supply of food this quickly had death staring them in the face. Like, that was a direct quote. But they ended up equally dividing the food that was left, and Captain Tucker warned everyone to be careful. And they're not the only ones immediately starving, because the next day, those still left at Truckee Lake are immediately starving again too. Like, Mrs. Graves went to Breen asking to borrow any kind of meat, dog, or ox. And he's like, why do they think I have meat to spare when he knows they have plenty of hides and he lives on the same thing? So why everyone is immediately starving again, I don't know. Because the First Relief left the food supply with them at the lake. Everyone ate before they left. So why everyone is like starving to death staring them in the face so soon, I don't know. Although one of the men in the First Relief said that when they took 2 of the 3 children back, he felt terrible because they were being doomed to death. So it's completely possible they didn't actually leave enough food, and they knew they didn't leave enough for everyone there. On the 24th, John Denton, friend/teamster for the Donners, collapsed and said he couldn't go any further. He was also snowblind. They tried to wait for him to recover, but he wasn't able to, and honestly they couldn't wait, so they made a fire for him and told him that he would have help soon. They didn't really believe Denton would live to see the help, but they had to keep moving because everyone else was in danger of the same fate. The next day, 3-year-old Ada Keseberg died and was buried in the snow. Mrs. Keseberg left with Ada and the First Relief, but Louis Keseberg was left at the lake because of his foot. Mrs. Keseberg actually offered $25 in a gold watch to anyone who would carry her child through, and someone did carry her through, but it wasn't enough to keep Ada alive, probably because they were sleeping on snow and, she was too cold. When they made it to where more food was stored, half of it was missing again. The next day, back at Truckee Lake, things took a turn for the worse. Mrs. Murphy spoke of digging up and eating Teamster Elliot after previously complaining about not being able to keep the wolves from trying to get to people's remains. It's possible she got the idea because apparently the Donners told the First Relief men that they would eat the dead people at their camp if they weren't able to find their cattle buried under like 12 feet of snow. On the 27th, Reed and the Second Relief ran into the First Relief in Bear Valley. He was surprised to discover even the relief party was starving, but he gave them as much as he could without endangering his own rescue effort. I can only imagine how amazing the reunion between Reed and his family had to feel, considering when he left them months prior, Virginia Reed didn't think she would ever see him again. But knowing he had 2 children still back at Truckee Lake was probably the push Reed needed to overcome what was coming next. Once the Second Relief was made aware of the people still at Truckee Lake, they sent the Native American ahead with food to give to them. He made it to them on the 28th and gave them California soap root. Breen said he was very friendly, gave them a few roots, and then went on his way. What shocked them, though, was that he was walking on snowshoes with strings made of bark, and he was somehow able to walk through extremely deep snow for many miles. The First Relief stayed in Bear Valley on the 28th and made it to the camp where the men left their mules on the way to Truckee Lake. Now, even though Captain Tucker kept warning everyone to be careful with how they ate and guarded the food the best they could, 12-year-old William Hook, Jacob Donner's stepson from his wife's previous marriage, snuck into the food, overate, and fell sick. 2 of the Murphy kids were left with Hook and a nurse who was supposed to help them. One of the Murphy kids was unable to walk because his feet were so swollen, his sister chose to stay with him. Well, Hook died and the nurse left. So 11-year-old Murphy took the extra food out of Hook's pockets, had his sister cut off his shoes, and walked, barefoot and bloody, to the next camp. Now, when the First Relief made it to Truckee Lake, one of the men alleged that the survivors had started eating the remains of the dead. He was the only person to say that, and none of the journal entries mentioned that happening at Truckee Lake at that time at all. But going through the journal entries, it was more than a little suspicious that some of the people seemed to have meat that lasted months past others, and it's not like anyone was hunting or anything. But no one ever mentioned or wrote about resorting to cannibalism prior to the First Relief arriving. However, it's possible that they just didn't record that happening, because who wants to admit something like that? But it seems like after the First Relief left, they definitely ate some remains. It was said that among the cabins, the fleshless bones and half-eaten bodies of the victims of famine, and that when Reed showed up offering them food, the Breens weren't hungry. And the same could be said for some of the other people still at Truckee Lake. Given what I said earlier about everyone in the First Relief, like literally starving after leaving, and that one of the men felt like he was leaving the children to die, I don't think the First Relief left any sort of significant amount of food at Truckee Lake. So if they weren't cannibals before that point, they definitely were after. But when Reed and the Second Relief arrived, they let everyone know they were planning to leave in 2 or 3 days, once people's strength was better. He reunited with his 2 children and then went to check on the Donners. George Donner was still ill with his infected cut, and his wife still refused to leave him. Reed tried to convince her to go with him and bring their remaining children, but she refused because Reed told them a 3rd relief party was being sent from Johnson's ranch and should be there in a few days' time. The 3rd relief was being led by S. Woodworth and was supposed to have left Johnson's ranch a few days after he did with the 2nd relief. Now, Jacob Donner's wife, Elizabeth, decided to stay too, but she sent along 2 of her children with the other members of the party who were too weak or injured to travel with the First Relief. It was 17 people in all, mostly women, children, and elderly. Reed left 1 or 2 men behind from the relief party to take care of the people still unable to leave, including Keseberg, George Donner and his wife Tamsin, and Mrs. Murphy. Some were left at Truckee Lake, and some were left at the Donners' camp by Alder Creek. Now, I honestly don't know how I feel about James Reed, given the time period, but he definitely gives main character, right? He immigrated from Ireland, fought with Abraham Lincoln, tried to move his family across America/Mexico, then went off to get help, then joined the Navy, fought with them, then got the Navy to help him, and then he came all the way back to get his children and to help others. And it seems like he either didn't know the extent of how poorly his family was treated by some of these people, or he's incredibly understanding and forgiving. Because before he left, he took care of Keseberg, Louis Keseberg, the guy that no one likes with the messed up foot. Reed gave him a bath, washed him, combed his hair, and treated him kindly. It's possible that Reed was kind to him because he heard about Keseberg giving a portion of the flour brought by Stanton from Sutter's Fort to Reed's children. But he also promised to come back in 2 weeks to carry Keseberg over the mountains. So I don't know. If he heard about how Mrs. Graves treated his family, demanding payment by taking what was essentially their only food source and not using it, he also didn't outwardly act on it with her. Because before they left, Mrs. Graves went to where she stored stuff in one of the wagons and grabbed about 800 pieces of gold and silver. So the demanding payment wasn't a money thing. It wasn't required at that moment for them to take Reed's hides when they did. And since the Graves were one of the families that had meat longer than the others, it's questionable to say the least. On March 2nd, the second relief with more members of the Donner Party left Truckee Lake. Everyone left behind was each left with half a teacup's worth of flour and half a pound of jerked beef, which doesn't seem like a week's supply, but it's all they could spare. And if that was similar to the amount left and portioned out to everyone the first time, it makes sense why everyone was immediately starving before. The first day or two was slow moving with the second relief because they were only moving a handful of miles a day. But apparently, at one point at the upper end of Truckee Lake, someone jokingly suggested to play a game to see who should have all of Mrs. Graves' money. Apparently, she didn't like this because the next morning she stayed behind when everyone else started walking and hid her money behind a large rock. That became somewhat of a rumor because for a while, the money had never been found. But apparently in 1891, a miner from Sierra Valley found silver coins while on the north shore of the lake. Him and a couple other men searched the area and found almost 200 coins of various nationalities and denominations pretty close to a large rock similar to the rumors. Now, because they were moving much slower than Reed was on his way there, he sent 3 men ahead to grab the stored food from the first location. If it hadn't been disturbed by animals, then one person would bring it back to Reed while the other 2 went ahead to the next location where food was stored. On the 4th, the second relief was hit with a violent storm, and considering they were already camping on top of 20 feet or 6 meters of snow, things went south quickly. The only bright side was a group before them camped in the same spot, so everything needed to build a fire was already there. That night, Mrs. Graves was trying to feed her baby, and she's so malnourished that there's no milk coming out. And being so weak and frustrated, when she heard one of her other daughters ask her to come over and cover her with the blanket, her response was unnatural. So someone went to check on Mrs. Graves and realized she was past the point of return. Like, she wasn't dead, but she was dying. So they took the baby and covered Mrs. Graves with the blanket, and it just was what it was. Back at the Donner camp, the 2 second relief men left to help the Donners realized it was not a wise idea to stay there. So they told Mrs. Donner, "Hey, we're leaving. We want to try and catch up with the rest of the group." But she still didn't want to leave her husband. So she begged the men to take the rest of her children with them to California so they could be saved. She agreed to pay them, but it's unclear if she paid them then or agreed to pay them after they made it to safety. Either way, the men took the 3 Donner children from their parents, but instead of taking them with them on their way to Reed, they took them back to Louis Keseberg at Truckee Lake. On the 6th, the blizzard stopped, and Reed kind of cracked a little. He was suffering from snow blindness and suffering from the cold. If it weren't for McCutcheon keeping the fire going during the storm, they probably would have all died there. As it was, Mrs. Graves died, and unfortunately, 5-year-old Isaac Donner, who was Jacob's son, also died. But as soon as the storm stopped, on the 7th, Reed got everyone to leave. Well, except Breen and his family. Because Breen said if he had to die, he would rather die in camp than on the way to help. It was weird to Reed because the entire Breen family was strong enough to travel. So he told Breen that they should come with them because if they were going to die, they should all die together trying to get out. This didn't faze Breen at all, so Reed gathered some witnesses and told Breen that if his family died, their blood would be on Breen's head and not his. Before Reed left, they chopped enough wood to keep the fire going for the Breens for several days. The Breens were taking care of their own 5 children, the 4 orphan grave children, and Mary Donner, so they all stayed with Breen. That same day, the first relief with the Donner Party survivors made it to Johnson's ranch. That's where Eddie and Foster learned about what happened to their families. Eddie heard his wife and one of his children had died, but one of them was still at Truckee Lake, most likely being retrieved by Reed. Foster believed his child was still alive and hoped to find his mother-in-law, Mrs. Murphy, who was blind, and his brother-in-law, Simon Murphy, alive. Both men would get on horses and catch up to the third relief party that left Johnson's ranch 4 days earlier. On the 8th, after 4 days without food, the second relief made it to the first camp where the 3 men had been sent before. Apparently, the delay was when they made it to this first location of stored food, it had been taken by animals, so they went on to the next one. But then they got hit with a storm, so they had to wait for it to clear before they could come back. Well, Reed and the Donner Party made it to the camp before the men returned. But when they returned, they made enough noise to alert the third relief, who was close enough to hear them, I guess. So the third relief sent men to tell the second relief to come down to their camp. Everyone in the second relief camp was too tired, but they did ask for something to eat, and they were given that. After that, a few people chose to go to the third relief camp. Reed and the rest of the second relief made it to where the third relief was camped 2 days later in Bear River Valley. When Reed made it, he told them that they had to go help the Breens, and those still stuck at Truckee Lake immediately. But Woodworth, who was in charge of the third relief, looked at how rough everyone in the second relief appeared and said he wasn't going without a guide. So Foster and Eddie said that they would pay anyone who would go with them to help their families. And of course, everyone there was like, you guys don't have anything to give. So Reed and someone else said that they would cover the cost. Then John Stark, in the third relief, said he was going to go regardless of the payday, but the snow made it so that only men of a certain size could complete the task. Because each man had to carry 50 pounds of food, and Stark was 224 pounds, he literally couldn't go and carry everything by himself. Eddie and Foster at this point decided that they would just go ahead themselves, but Reed stopped them until he could convince more people to help them. Eventually, Woodworth agreed to pay $3 per day to every man who carried a child that wasn't his own out of the mountains, since he received authorization to offer that. After that, Eddie and Foster, along with 5 other men, would become the third relief party to continue on to get the rest of the Donner Party. Reed and everyone else continued on to Johnson's ranch. On the 12th, the third relief found the body of John Denton and the food he was left with previously. He was found sitting with his back leaning against a snowbank and his head bowed down on his chest, indicating he fell asleep and froze to death rather than starved. After that, they made their way to where the Breens were camped at. When the third relief found them, the fire had melted the snow down to the ground, so there was a giant 12 or 15 foot wide hole, 24 feet deep, that had steps made of snow for them to go in and out of the hole. Now, Mrs. Breen claimed that she sent one of her children down by the fire to test the ground down there, and once they realized it was dry and warm in the hole, she had everyone go down there together. She said it was once they moved that they realized one of the grave children had died, and claimed that his sister, who was just so hungry, begged them to cut off a piece of him for her to eat. And even though they didn't want to do it, they couldn't deny giving a starving child something to eat. The Breens said they didn't have any of the kid at all, and only the Graves children ate their brother. Considering most of the children weren't even old enough to walk, it wasn't a story most people believe. But because so many children weren't able to walk, the third relief had to figure out who they would take and who they would essentially sentence to death. Because yeah, hopefully someone else would come out there, but they couldn't guarantee it because as it was, they themselves had to be paid to come out to help them. And they didn't have enough arms to carry everyone. But not liking what they saw and heard, the third relief voted to take the 3 Graves children and marry Donner and leave the Breen family there. John Stark didn't agree with that decision, though, because he said, quote, "No, gentlemen, I will not abandon these people. I am here on a mission of mercy, and I will not do half the work. You can all go if you want to, but I shall stay here by these people while they and I live," end quote. That same day, the second relief made it to Sutter's Fort. On the 13th, the third relief made it to Truckee Lake, and they were absolutely shocked at what had happened between the second relief leaving and them arriving. After the two men left the Donners' camp, only Nicholas Clark was there from the second relief to help out with the Donners. On the third day of Clark being there, he woke up to see the tent he was staying in buried in snow. With him in the tent was Elizabeth Donner, who was Jacob's wife, and her son Louis, and John Baptiste Trudeau. George and Tamsin Donner were in their own tent, and they had Elizabeth Donner's younger child with them. Apparently, the food ran out on the first day, and the storm following caused the snow to be too deep to get wood. Over the last couple of days, there was no fire in either of the tents. When the storm finally stopped, they realized Louis Donner died, and Elizabeth was inconsolable. Clark helped to bury him. After a couple of days, Clark was able to get some wood and noticed fresh bear cub tracks. He managed to hunt it and kill it, which provided food for the Donners from that point onward. Unfortunately, according to Clark, it was too late to save Elizabeth Donner and her youngest son, Samuel, except the Samuel part is contradicted a bit later, so I'll come back to that. Around that same time, in the Murphy's cabin, there was Mrs. Murphy and her son Simon, her grandchild George Foster, Eddie's 3-year-old son James, and 3 of the Donner girls, Frances, Georgia, and Eliza. They were all living with Louis Keseberg. Well, that night, apparently Keseberg took James Eddy to bed with him, and all the children knew was that James Eddy was dead the next morning. Mrs. Murphy, completely blind, took him and sat down near the bed where the Donner sisters were lying, and held James Eddy in her lap and accused Keseberg of killing him. At some point, he got tired of hearing that, so Keseberg took the child and hung him up on the wall inside of the cabin. The next day, at the Donners' camp, Tamsin Donner was so worked up that Clark decided to go to Truckee Lake and see if anyone had heard anything about the group that left. Well, it sounds like he stumbled upon what happened in the Murphy cabin, because he instantly decided he was leaving and going to California. He went back to Mrs. Donner and told her that her children were in Murphy's cabin and that he believed their lives were in danger of a death more violent than starvation. He told her he was leaving and taking a portion of what little meat was left and started on the journey back. John Baptiste joined him. Mrs. Donner refused to leave her husband alone at night, but she told Clark and Baptiste that she would check on her children the next day. And the day after that is when the third relief showed up, and Eddie learned what happened to his last living family member, and that Keseberg ate him. Obviously, Eddie wanted to kill him, but he said he couldn't kill Keseberg there, considering the state Keseberg was in. But if he ever made it to San Francisco, Eddie would absolutely kill him there. This is part of why no one likes Keseberg, and he's actually accused of all of the murders. Clark and Baptiste were about to leave Truckee Lake when the third relief arrived, so they were able to fill in what they witnessed. When Eddie made it to the Donners, George Donner was still alive, and Tamsin refused to leave him while he was still helpless. She was fully healed and capable of traveling on her own, but she couldn't accept leaving him there to die all by himself. She begged Eddie to take her children for $1,500 in silver. He turned down the money and said he wouldn't even require $100 because he would save her children or die trying. That's the equivalent of over $62,000 today. She asked him to take Samuel too, the youngest that Clark claimed died with his mother, but Eddie wasn't able to carry Samuel and her 3 daughters. She said they would just wait for another rescue, and Eddie let her know another relief party would be far out if one came at all. Considering the first relief party informed everyone the snow would likely be there until June, and again, the help that they had now was tough enough to get, the third relief couldn't leave any food for those choosing to stay. So it felt like a final goodbye between the Donners and their children. Keseberg also chose to stay. Everyone believes he wanted a chance to go through the belongings everyone left behind. It sounds like he's not as immobile as he portrayed himself to be. So it was Louis Keseberg, Lavanya Murphy, George and Tamsin Donner, and Samuel Donner. Now, about Samuel Donner. It said Tamsin Donner offered to pay Clark to take Samuel, but he turned it down and chose to take belongings of the Donner Party members that were left behind. So he couldn't carry the baby because his hands were too full of other people's stuff he decided was his now. The third relief left with everyone that wanted to leave and caught up with Stark, who was still with the Breens. All of them collectively made it to Woodworth on March 16th, who gave them all more food. Eddie told Woodworth that there were still people at Truckee Lake needing rescue, and Woodworth pretty much said there was no way he was staying there any longer than he already had. The manpower and resources needed to rescue 5 people, 4 of which were adults, wasn't worth the risk for those who would have had to go back to them. As it was, every relief group came back struggling and starving. After that, the third relief made their way to safety, with Stark carrying multiple people. Apparently, even on their way to rescue the Donner Party, initially, he carried several of the rescue party when they were too tired to continue. He was as strong as 2 men, they said. The third relief made it to the settlements on March 19th. When Woodworth made it to Johnson's ranch, he found a letter from a few men, including Stark and John Rhodes, the man who initially built the boat to row to Sutter's Fort and alert them of what was happening. The letter said that they wanted to go back and retrieve those still stuck at Truckee Lake. So Woodworth sent them immediately with horses and food, hoping that they would succeed, at least saving 2 of the people still there. He figured Mrs. Donner and Keseberg could be saved, but didn't think George or Samuel Donner and Mrs. Murphy would make it, because it would be impossible to move them because they were so weak. Foster and a son of Mrs. Graves volunteered to join too. In total, 7 men would make up the 4th relief group. In the end, though, they would all end up turning back when they made it to Bear Valley because of a snowstorm. They tried again a few weeks later on April 13th, 1847, and made it to Truckee Lake in 3 days. What they saw horrified them. They expected to at least see Mrs. Donner and Keseberg alive, but when they entered the cabins, they saw human bodies, terribly mutilated, legs, arms, and skulls scattered everywhere, in every direction. A body they guessed was Mrs. Eddy laid near the entrance with the limbs severed off and a frightful gash in her skull. The flesh from the bones was nearly consumed, and a painful stillness lingered in the cabin. The men assumed everyone was dead until they heard someone shout, so they ran in the direction of the sound until they realized it was just 3 natives hiding that ran off when they saw the men running towards them. They decided to check in at Donner's camp, and about halfway there, they saw fresh tracks in the snow. Excited at the idea that someone survived, they followed them to Jacob Donner's old tent. Inside, they found property of every description: books, teas, coffee, shoes, household items, everything in every direction from everyone. And at the opening of the tent, there was a large iron kettle filled with human flesh cut up. It was the body of George Donner with the head split open and the brains extracted. It was clear he hadn't been dead long, 4 days at most, and next to the kettle there was a chair with 3 legs of cattle that had been killed in the early part of winter and had clearly been frozen before it could be prepared. The animal meat was found to be edible and good, and for some reason, completely untouched, minus a small piece bitten from the shoulder. The 4th relief gathered up some of the property and camped for the night. The next morning, some of the men followed the tracks of the person that left the day before, while 3 others stayed behind to hide property they couldn't bring but wanted to come back for later. They were aware the Donners had a significant amount of money, but they couldn't find it. The men following the tracks lost them because the snow was melting, so they decided to just head back to the cabins. To their surprise, they found Keseberg lying down among the human bones, and beside him, there was a large pan full of fresh liver. They asked him what happened to everyone else, especially Mrs. Donner. He told them that Mrs. Murphy died a week after the 3rd relief left because she was too weak and he couldn't revive her, and that Mrs. Donner tried to come to Truckee Lake from Alder Creek, where she was at, and lost the trail and had to spend the night in the wilderness. When she finally made it to his cabin the next night, she was so exhausted he made her a cup of coffee, rolled her up in blankets in bed, and the next morning, he found her dead. He ate her body and realized her flesh was the best he had ever tasted. It apparently had at least 4 pounds of fat. The 4th relief were unable to find a single trace of Mrs. Donner or Mrs. Murphy. They knew that when the 3rd relief left, she was in perfect health and just didn't want to leave her husband. She offered $500 to anyone who would come and bring them both back to California, and she said it in front of Keseberg. The Fourth Relief believed that it was Mrs. Donner that ate the small piece of beef from the shoulder of the animal. So they started grilling Keseberg and asked him a bunch of questions like, where did this blood come from in the kettles if you're saying you only ate those already dead? To that one, Keseberg said, quote, there's blood in dead bodies, end quote. They started asking him where Mrs. Donner's money was, and he acted super confused, saying he didn't know anything about it and that she must have hidden it before she died. So the men went through all the stuff he had in the cabin, and they found silks and jewelry that had been taken from the Donners worth a couple $100, and on Keseberg they found several pistols that belonged to George Donner. And after removing the pistols, they saw something hidden on him, so when they went to take it, they found several $100s in gold. Now, before the Fourth Relief left for Truckee Lake, Mrs. Keseberg told them that Keseberg barely had any money on him, so the men told him that they knew he was lying and that he knew where the Donners' money was. Keseberg swore he knew nothing about it and that he didn't have any of their property with him. Everything they saw was his. One of the men pulled him aside and told him, if you tell us where you hid her money, we'll help you make it out of here. But if you keep lying, we'll kill you. And they gave him until the next day to decide what he wanted to do. The next day, one of the men basically strangled Keseberg until he confessed to where the money was. Now, Keseberg would come up with this story about how Mrs. Murphy died a week after the Third Relief left, and Mrs. Donner came to him after 2 weeks when George Donner died. She was frantic, saying she was desperate to make it to her children. But before she left, she gave Keseberg the money to give to her children in case she didn't make it across the mountain. Keseberg said he didn't tell the men where the money was because he didn't know who they were or why they wanted it until they showed him the document authorizing them to come retrieve all of the Donner Party belongings in reward for a portion of everything they recovered. Before the Fourth Relief left, Keseberg wanted to gather some remains of the Donner Party. The men asked him why he didn't eat the entire animal that was completely edible back at Donner's camp, and he eventually confessed that the meat was too dry and that liver and eyes were much better, and brains make good soup. Honestly, it sounds like Keseberg probably didn't think people would come back so soon, if at all, and when he saw them coming, he ran off to hide because he didn't know how they would react to what I can only imagine was an incredibly distressing sight in those cabins. I mean, I didn't even tell you half of what was in these descriptions, but it sounds like he just was scared and didn't know what they would do to him, and he knew how he had been perceived prior to this point. During the return journey on April 22nd, Keseberg accidentally stumbled upon the body of his dead 3-year-old Ada Keseberg, and that's how he figured out she was dead. He had no idea up until that point. And on April 25th, 1847, the Fourth Relief made it back to the settlement. A year after the Donner Party set off on the Oregon Trail, everything finally wrapped up. Of the 87 that were trapped, 39 died. Most of the survivors were children and women. The only 2 families to survive intact were the Reeds and the Breens. Eddie lost his entire family and had to start over, and actually thinking about it, they didn't just die, his entire family was eaten. He tried to go after Keseberg and kill him, but Reed talked him out of it. The Murphys, Donners, and Graves were orphaned, but the Murphys and Donners recovered relatively well. The Graves were worse off, but they could probably thank their mother for that because, like Keseberg, she is not well liked and comes off horrible in this story. Keseberg was, of course, accused of murdering everyone, and it ruined his reputation to the point where he sued for defamation. He won, but the judge only awarded him $1. To his credit, he tried to save the reputation of Tamsen Donner by saying she never turned to cannibalism, even though everyone knows she did. Her children are actually the ones that accused him of killing her, and what caused him to have to sue. But right after his rescue, he worked for Captain Sutter and captained his ship taking wheat to San Francisco. The passengers would complain that Keseberg would cry in his sleep, haunted by his past. Allegedly, he was fired from that job because passengers complained that the boat traveled so slowly that Keseberg might be tempted to kill sleeping passengers for food. Keseberg ended up owning a hotel later on after making money during the California gold rush. It was pretty successful, but it burned down a year after opening, so he went into other business ownerships. He and his wife went on to have 8 more children, all girls, and he eventually did an interview a few decades later to save his reputation. He obviously told a very different story to what everyone else did, but it wasn't enough to help him. However, the interviewer believed Keseberg's innocence and set up a meeting between Keseberg and the youngest daughter of Tamsin Donner, Eliza. Apparently, she changed her mind about Keseberg's guilt after meeting with him. Unfortunately, Keseberg's reputation never fully recovered, and he would outlive his wife and all but one of his daughters. He died penniless and homeless in a Sacramento County hospital for the poor. His grave has never been found and is believed to be unmarked. Now, many survivors and descendants of the Donner Party swear up and down that they or their relatives never ate people. Obviously, we know that's not true, although the Reeds may have a case for saying they didn't, but then you have to think about the kids left behind, and I'm sure they had to eat something. But I digress. This story is lined up so perfectly for you to see how quickly things go from bad to worse, and how humans get to the point where saying no to cannibalism rapidly turns to yes. There's so much to it, and I mean, I could go on for forever, but I won't. Follow or subscribe if you haven't already, and stay safe. I'll be back on Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.